I can add one to that too, is if you have to uninstall OneDrive because it's behaving badly and you reinstall it, all those folders are still going to be there, but they're not actually syncing, but yet they look like they're syncing, but they're not syncing. And if you don't realize they're not syncing for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 days, you will argue with someone that your sync is just fine and it's not your fault and the file is just not there and they didn't do it right, when in fact, you're just not syncing.
Today's topic, OneDrive and sync. This was a request that's in the list. I don't know if any of you have the list up, but we definitely something we talked about. So spotlight on Mark and Todd today, who spent the most time on this. 3 main things, the different things we mean when we say OneDrive, or that people mean when they say OneDrive, and where it manifests. A little bit more about the sync and the add shortcut capabilities. Let's talk about those manifestations, where we see OneDrive and what we do with it.
Yeah, so this one I pushed hard for this slide, and part of it is because I'm very pedantic and very literal, and I think Mark shares my love for pedantism also, or pedant. Anyway, and
are you calling me a pedant?
I am. We can smell our own. One of the things that Microsoft does a lot that we really hate is they give the same name to various things. And OneDrive, in my opinion, is one of the worst suffering things for that. So I wanted to have a slide out there so that we could talk about all the different things that OneDrive can be, because there ends up being a lot of confusion on this. And I see this when I talk to customers who are moving from like file shares to the cloud or whatever. I start talking about OneDrive, it means different things to different people. So OneDrive can be a location. So that can be, a SharePoint location. It can also be a personal location. So Microsoft used to differentiate those as OneDrive for Business and OneDrive Personal. I think they're starting to move away from that. But for SharePoint on-prem for the longest time, there was a link on the top that said OneDrive used to be My Files or something like that, and they changed it to OneDrive. That was OneDrive for Business on-prem, so it was your My Site. Then there was the OneDrive, the personal thing that was, built on your Hotmail or whatever account. So OneDrive can be a location, and it can be in SharePoint Online, SharePoint on-prem, or it can be personal. OneDrive can be the sync client for OneDrive. So you've got whatever your OneDrive is on your Windows PC or your Mac or whatever, you can install OneDrive that is the sync client that syncs your OneDrive to your PC. But for extra confusion, the OneDrive client also syncs everything that's not OneDrive. It syncs all of your SharePoint stuff. So when people say, I'm syncing OneDrive, to some people that might be their SharePoint content because they see the app called OneDrive and they think that that's where it's at. There's a mobile app called OneDrive that you can use to access that stuff on your phones and your tablets and things like that. And then also, we weren't entirely sure where to put all this, but with the OneDrive sync client, you can choose to back up the common folders inside of Windows. Used to be known as known folder move, but that's like photos, documents, downloads, videos, whatever. And it will take those known folders inside of Windows and move them into OneDrive. So then that gets kind of confusing if things are in OneDrive or not. But for the rest of this thing, when we say OneDrive, it could be any number of things. So try to keep up. If it's confusing, ask us, which we mean. But it's.
And Todd, I think we talked about
Microsoft uses.
Backup. Go ahead, Mark.
Microsoft uses these terms interchangeably in conversations because they all work with this stuff every day. So when somebody says, they just say, "Oh, well, I use OneDrive for that." Well, which one do you mean is often the next question. And it can be very confusing.
Yeah, and I can't remember if we have a slide on this or not, but where that really comes up is when they talk about features and capabilities and things like that. They'll say OneDrive does this. And if you're a person who uses the personal version of OneDrive, it may or may not be there because they mean OneDrive for Business, or they mean the sync client, or it's a mess.
Let's talk about what that looks like on our desktops, in our system tray, etc.
This is actually a snapshot of my system tray from yesterday sometime. And by system tray, we mean, in Windows 10 or 11, or actually going back a bunch of Windows versions, down on the bottom right, if you look at the little icons down there, you might see different colors and flavors of these things. So the one on the left is a OneDrive for Business that happened to be syncing at the time. That's what that little
Very
arrow
fortuitous,
circle means. So that one was actually doing some work at the time. The other three are different tenants where I have synced some content. So at the moment, I'm syncing from 4 different Microsoft 365 tenants, various libraries, various whatevers. And that's why I have 4 of those blue little clouds. The gray cloud, or not blue cloud, is my OneDrive personal. So that's how you can tell the difference between those 2 services. But you can't, unless you hover over any one of the blue clouds, tell which one is which. But if you do hover over, you do see which tenant it comes from. And what you'll see is OneDrive dash and the name of the tenant organization, not the tenant name itself. So for instance, our tenant is simpraxis.sharepoint.com. You don't see that. You see, in our case, Simpraxis Consulting.
Yeah, the descriptor. Yep. So Mark Crispin in the chat room is like, 4 tenants. Yeah, that's pretty common. I don't have a lot going on with sharing stuff with customers right now. I've got 4 and a personal one. It's not uncommon.
I've had probably 8 or 10 at some point, and at a certain point it just gets a little ridiculous, and it's hard to manage. So as consultants, we get into this multi-tenant thing all the time. And luckily it seems to work. I mean, you can have 4, you can have 8, you can have 10. The tricky part is less about, is OneDrive going to do what it's supposed to do? It sort of sits there in the background and generally does what you want.
Yeah.
It's more about, okay, I've got these different tenants synced. I want to open something in Word, and I want to make sure that I'm using the account that matches that tenant. That is a whole other can of worms that we'll skip.
It's a whole other Ask Simpraxis. What account are you logged in as in each app? Yes.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. We can't talk at great length, but I will say a couple of things about that. So when you find yourself stumbling into that, what that'll happen is you'll have Windows or Word up potentially. Even if you browse to the file system that happens to be synced with OneDrive, Word will pick up that it's synced with OneDrive and ask you for the account. And so the way that I have minimized, not removed, mind you, minimized the occurrence of those problems is I will open Word empty, change to the account that I know is the one that has access, and then that gets my success rate up to probably 75, 80%. So, yeah. Another thing that I wanted to mention here is all of those OneDrive, Mark mentioned that it runs pretty well. All of those are separate processes. And so I've actually got one right now. My account password has changed, and so it broke the sync, but it only broke the sync for that one tenant. The rest are going fine. And that OneDrive client also runs in user space in your hard drive. And so it can update itself automatically. Since it's not in one of the protected folders, you don't need to be an admin, you don't need to trigger UAC. It actually can update itself in the background, which is cool unless you're one of those folks that tries to control what version of things are running because you're an IT pro or whatever, but it does update itself automatically.
If your organization hasn't prevented it from updating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why I bring it up. If you're one of those places that wants to prevent it, that's a thing to prevent.
All right, let's dive into sync a little bit. I think, Mark, we were talking about this when you were leading us on this.
So in a SharePoint library, which is where we spend all of our time because we love SharePoint, and SharePoint libraries are the best thing on the whole planet.
The
right?
bestest. Hugs all around.
There are 2 links, buttons, chunks of text with icons you can click on. We've sort of lost our distinction over the years, but there are 2 things you can click on. One is sync and one is add shortcut to OneDrive. And they do slightly different things, and they can cause problems if you try to mix the 2. So here's the toolbar from any old generic SharePoint library. And if you click the sync button, what you end up with is a sync point in your File Explorer underneath the organization name. So you notice the organization that I'm a member of here in this example is Simpraxis Consulting. And if I did a sync on the documents library inside the Ask Simpraxis site, I would end up with a folder, sort of a virtual folder, named Asks and Praxis -documents inside the organization fake folder that's blue there. If I click on Add Shortcut to OneDrive, the behavior is a little bit different. Go to the next slide, Mike. There, I'm accomplishing two things that sort of support each other, but are sort of different from a use perspective. So I click Add Shortcut to OneDrive. It says it's going to add that shortcut for me. When I go to the OneDrive service, which is that upper left screenshot, I then see the library inside OneDrive listed as a virtual folder. And you notice there's a little, you probably can't see it all that well, but there's a little lock on top of the folder to show that it's, or maybe it's a chain. I think it's a chain that shows that it's a link to a folder that lives somewhere else. And you notice over on under sharing, it sort of gives me a clue. Owner is sales, so that's from the sales site. And you'll notice down below, where does it show up in my file explorer? Well, it shows up in a different place. It's not under the organization name. It's under OneDrive-organization, which is my OneDrive. What used to be my site is really what our OneDrive now is, our cloud-based OneDrive. And then that file folder sits underneath that node in the tree, and it's got that little lock kind of, or what, not lock, little chain thing, little link thing. That's right. It's a link pointing out that it goes somewhere else. So the behavior is slightly different. It lands in a different place in your local machine, and you can't do both. You can't take both actions on the same I'll say object, because sometimes it's a library, but usually it's a library. It could be a folder. If you try to sync, if you try to add a shortcut to OneDrive where you've already synced it, and actually on the left view, the library that's labeled as documents-sales, I actually have already got that one synced. I've clicked the synced button on that before. So it gleefully added that link into OneDrive for me, but it doesn't sync down to the machine. It never shows up because I've already got it synced the other way. And that's sort of a bugaboo with this thing. So the advice that Todd and I debated this a little bit because we were talking to a client yesterday. The advice that a lot of people who've been around SharePoint for a long time or have used OneDrive for a long time just say, always use the sync button, never touch that Add Shortcut to OneDrive. It's horrible. Don't do that. I can actually see some reasons to use Add Shortcut to OneDrive, but you sort of want to be consistent and pick one or the other. Because if you try to mix and match a lot, you're going to get yourself into some situations where things aren't acting the way that you want them to. They're not really broken, but they're not behaving in the way you would expect, like with that documents-sales library, which never showed up on my local machine. So if I did that before I got on an airplane, I'd be pissed off.
Yeah. The other example of a reason for maybe doing the Add Shortcut to OneDrive is if you accessed a lot of stuff on the mobile device, and then you could pull all of that stuff up in the mobile app as opposed to having to switch between the OneDrive mobile app and the SharePoint mobile app or the Office mobile app.
So you sort of, and this is one of those cases where Microsoft says, it's great, you have options. And most people in your organization are saying, yeah, but I don't want options. I want you to tell me which one to do.
Yeah.
And I think, again, us old school SharePoint people would probably say, we'll use sync because that was there first. We all got used to using that. And then Add Shortcut to OneDrive came later. So most of us are just sort of tending more towards sync.
Yeah, and Mark hit on it a little bit, but I want to kind of reiterate. You sync the object, the level at which you sync is the document library. So you can't sync a site. You can sync a document library inside of a site. And that would come up if you decided to scale by document library. So one of the customers Mark and I are doing a migration for now, they have a very valid reason for it. They're creating 6 or 7 document libraries for every site that they stamp out, which works well. But if they were going to be trying to sync to their desktop, every one of those, they would have to sync all 7 of those document libraries if they wanted all of that content down locally.
You can actually sync a folder inside a document library down as deep as you want to. So that's why I said object. You can create, you can sync the entire document library or whatever folder you happen to be in, whatever the context is at the time is what we'll sync.
Yeah, but the largest object you can sync is a document library.
Yes.
The other thing that I wanted to bring up, because we didn't really have a space for this, is Mark was talking earlier about how, OneDrive's just in the background doing his job, syncing things. And when he said that, I agree with it. But it's funny how like 5 or 6 years ago, nobody would have ever said that phrase non-ironically because OneDrive was horrible back in the day. And its list of crimes is long and horrible. And I remember at an MVP summit several years ago, when they were on site, we had a session with the product manager for that, and I can't remember his name. Well, Ruben something. But we were all ready. We had the pitchforks, we had the torches. We were gonna just really give him the what for. And he walks in, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he's like, "You're right. I'm sorry. It's a huge mess. We suck. I get why you hate our deal." And he's like, "So we can spend the next hour with you yelling at me and me agreeing with you. Or we can all agree that it sucks, and I can tell you the things that we're going to do to try to make it better."
That was so disappointing. Remember how disappointed we all were because we couldn't yell at him because he'd already fought. He took all the swords and fell on all the swords.
But it was, and so that was interesting because you don't get that a lot, that level of awareness. But what was super cool is he ended up doing almost all of the things that he said he was going to do. Like, it doesn't suck anymore. And he talked about a bunch of the capabilities, and they did add them to the product. So that was just, it was almost surreal because we were all ready and we were going to yell at him. He's like, "Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it sucks. Sorry about that." It was just the craziest thing. So yeah, I use it for everything. I never have any problems with OneDrive these days.
So let's talk about what we see when we're syncing, because this is where those of us who did the work, lived through that poorly performing sync client, this is where we'd spend a lot of time trying to decipher the glyphs that you see here. Want to talk about those?
Let's see, I captured all of those. I was trying to make all of these things happen in one library so that I could get all of the little icons right, and I ended up sort of copying and pasting a lot of images together because it's sort of hard to do. But say you're in File Explorer and you're looking at a file listing, you're going to see these little, there's a column that gets added or that displays in a sync endpoint as you're seeing it in File Explorer. It sort of tells you what the connection between is for that file between your machine and the cloud. So I think I got them all, but I may have missed one. And if somebody tells me I'll miss one, we can talk about it. But the first one is that little arrows in a circle. That means that particular object, and again, I'm going to say object because sometimes it's a file, sometimes it's a folder, sometimes it's an entire sync point, is currently syncing. There's the little client process is actually trying to reconcile a change that's happened on one end or the other. The second one, the little blue cloud outline, means that file, we know that file exists locally, but it's not stored on our local machine. It's online only. We can right click and ask it to be downloaded, or we can just double click that name and it will open up and it will basically download that file and then open it up. So at that point, we then have a file that's stored locally because we've asked for it. That's what we think of as files on demand. That came out maybe, I don't know, what, 2 years ago? COVID's totally ruined my brain.
Oh, way longer than that, probably
5 years ago, a billion years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
I think it was the epoch of the dinosaurs. It came out a while ago, and the idea is that when we first sync a sync endpoint, we get a directory of everything, but we don't get any of the files by default, which is great because we can know about, tens of gigabytes of files, but not have any of them stored locally, unless you go onto that airplane and you don't have Wi-Fi, and then you're screwed. So if you right click, you can decide to bring something offline. And you notice that third icon, the green circle with the checkbox, that would be, I've asked for it to be offline and it's already synced. So there's no little blue circle going on. There's a check mark, meaning the copy that's on my machine matches the copy that's in the cloud. The fourth one, the green filled in circle with the checkbox, means that I've asked for that file to always be kept on this device. There's a little bit of a difference between the green filled in circle and the green not filled in circle. OneDrive will actually, over time, watch your activity with these files and sort of clean up the clutter on your local machine. So if I've been syncing, we have a site for every client. So if I've been syncing a client library that hasn't had a change in it in 6 months, OneDrive will probably say, well, you don't actually need any of these files locally. So I'm gonna go back to the little blue outline cloud and make it an offline only file. So I'm sorry, online only file. So it's cleaning up the clutter. If I've right-clicked and said always keep on this device, that process won't mess with that file. You've basically said I always want to have a copy of that file on my machine, and OneDrive will respect that. So that's the difference between those two green ones. The last one is an online only file that has been shared with someone. So that means we've created a sharing link, and OneDrive is letting us know that that particular file has been shared with someone. And if you hover over it, you can actually see, generally you can see who it's been shared with. It can get sort of complicated if it's been a lot of people, but it gives you a little bit of a hint of who has access to it.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. I've not gone to the trouble of reproducing this, but I set up a new machine here in the last couple of weeks and signed into my personal OneDrive. So I don't know if this behavior would be personal or for business or both. But taking advantage of the files on demand, I wasn't really paying attention to the folders that got synced. The machine had a small C drive, and the initial OneDrive sync filled it up, and it looked like it was pulling files down and then deleting them or marking them as offline only or something. But it was doing this crazy thing where it was taking like my photos files in OneDrive, which is 70, 80 gigs, something like that, and it was filling the drive up with that, even though I wasn't syncing them. So it was a weird thing. I didn't expect it to happen.
Krista, that little image that you're showing, the little shared dude, the little gray guy, he can show up next to any one of these different statuses. So you can see some mixing and matching of these little icons.
Okay,
like
perfect.
like the one that you've shown.
That means your computer's about ready to explode, Krista. Run!
Not a
Run
surprise. I would believe that, yes.
Yeah, and Todd would like your credit card so he can come help you fix that.
Exactly.
Not a problem.
It should be.
Got that
Don't go there.
trustworthy
My
face.
passwords too, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
For safekeeping.
You know the drill.
Actually, about that, I do have a little bit of a question. So this computer, I am getting ready to retire it and return it back for leasing things. So is there a way to reverse this whole syncing thing aside from just getting rid of my account? What are the best ways, I guess, to unsync my account information from a computer before getting rid of it?
So you can remove the account. And so actually, let's table that question. We've got a somewhat related slide coming up that will.
Is it this slide when a sync is not a sync or a backup is not a backup? It's really more of a sync?
No.
I might just add, Krista, that you're going to want to factory reset that machine, but that's a completely different conversation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Should we keep going through this, or Scott?
Yeah.
Todd, do you want to skip forward to the one that's more relevant to Krista's question?
Well, we'll hit this one quick. So this is the whole known folder move or the backup of the known folders, pictures, test stuff. We wanted to bring this one up because it says backup everywhere in the UI, but this is not a backup. Do not believe it. It is not a backup. It is a sync only. And the difference would be that if it was a backup, well, I don't want to give away our next slide, but it doesn't behave like a backup. It says it's a backup. It believes it's a backup. It's not a backup. You still need to back these things up. But besides that, I use this everywhere. I do the known folder move, and that way, when my documents are all synced up, it's all good.
This was the conversation about Windows 10 and Windows 11 showing something slightly different more fly out, I think, than vertical menu, right?
Yeah, the UI has changed a little bit, and it's just as somebody who uses Windows 11, I'm still, and I have for about as long as it's been out almost. I still struggle with, well, where do I get this thing to happen? So it just seemed worth pointing out that if you do go to Windows 11, there's still a share icon at the top, and there's a little share flyout for OneDrive, which is a little different than the Windows 10 on the left.
Okay, so the next slide is I think the money shot, right? What can go wrong?
Ice cream can fall on the floor.
Oh, that is the most tragic. I can't even look at that. That's
Emily, why did you throw our ice cream on the floor?
Oh, I can't even. So Krista, this was kind of the thing. When you're removing OneDrive and your files and all that, mark through the image in the chat. Stop sync is the best way. I would remove the account and then, like Julie said, factory reset it, wipe the drive. The thing I wanted to cover here is do not delete it, because this does sync things. So if you think, oh, I need to store, free up the space on my machine, I'm going to delete it off of my C drive. It will delete it off of your C drive. That mission will be accomplished, but it's going to sync that delete up to the cloud, and it's going to delete it out of OneDrive too. So don't do that. Do the other things instead.
And actually, if you're working with one tenant and you're syncing a bunch of stuff from it, the easiest link to use to stop syncing is the unlink this PC link, which is that's we've said remove the account. That's actually what that link does, is it takes that account and removes all of the connections. The content that you've downloaded is still on your machine, so you still want to think about that, which is Julie's point. Make sure you wipe the thing.
Yeah.
I can add one to that too, is if you have to uninstall OneDrive because it's behaving badly and you reinstall it, all those folders are still going to be there, but they're not actually syncing, but yet they look like they're syncing, but they're not syncing. And if you don't realize they're not syncing for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 days, you will argue with someone that your sync is just fine and it's not your fault and the file is just not there and they didn't do it right, when in fact you're just not syncing anymore.
Hypothetically, like asking for a friend, Julie.
Hypothetically, that would happen to you.
I know someone.
Yeah, I actually just noticed in that screenshot that I put up there that one of the sync points is not syncing. Thanks for making me realize that. That was not intentional.
Yep.
So.
Mark mentioned how sync, using both sync and add shortcut on the same endpoint is going to cause you grief, and not obvious grief, because it's the deleting the thing to the cloud. Funny story about that is that exact thing happened, and I got a customer call, and somebody had done that. Her PC was filling up. She thought all those files were filling it up in OneDrive, so she deleted them out of OneDrive. Not only did it not free up space because it was the files on demand thing, but it deleted them all out of the cloud. She realized that, tried to start uploading them. She had deleted 100,000 files. It was like a pictures folder. So I've got a blog post on it about the recycle bin. It's a great one. So yeah, don't delete them on your PC.
And let's talk about some of the IA challenges with OneDrive compared to what we're used to in SharePoint. Just quickly, but I think we've got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, so you can very easily add stuff to a sync point on your local machine. You just drag a bunch of folder files in there, no big deal. Well, there's no content type selection. There's no metadata selection. So those files will sync up to the SharePoint document library into which you have dropped them, but you'll still have to go into the SharePoint library if you want to set a content type, you want to set metadata and stuff. So it's not a perfect world. Yeah, there's some weird things you can do with quick parts in Word, but I don't even think it's worth talking about that because it doesn't work as well as we'd like it to. So if you want to have a good, tight information architecture, you almost want to encourage people to do most of their adding and subtracting of content in the browser instead, so that they have the right sort of visual prompts and stuff, and get the metadata set the right way. Todd, you want to talk about that commas one?
Yeah, so we're Mark and I are not sure if this is still a problem, but it's bitten both of us in the past. That Mark mentioned earlier that when you sync a SharePoint library or folder, it says OneDrive dash and then the name of that tenant. That name is the description of your organization as it shows up in like the O365 admin screen. And I have my own tenant, as I'm sure everybody does, and I had a comma in the description, and that caused problems with OneDrive. And I can't remember exactly what it was, but the problem was something couldn't get added. I couldn't add my OneDrive, or I couldn't add a SharePoint thing or whatever. But it was that comma in the description for my organization. And then at Simpraxis, we had the same thing because we were Simpraxis Consulting, LLC or whatever. That's been around for a few years. Hopefully they've got that fixed. But if you're having weird problems, check to see if you have a comma in your organization name. And as I was trying to see if that was still an issue, I came up with another thing that goes on. If you change that string, that organization name, that will not retroactively change any previous OneDrive objects that you have synced, but new ones will get the new name. So you might end up getting different ones. The easiest way, if that's a problem, is just to stop syncing that folder and then go back in and resync it, and it'll pull in the new name. But that doesn't get refreshed, that name.
Yeah, it doesn't actually break anything, but it becomes really confusing. We changed Simpraxis's name from an LLC to an INC. And when we did that, all of a sudden, all of our OneDrive stuff started to go like this. And it was like, wait a minute, wait. And the easiest way to fix it was just to, like you said, unsync everything and then resync it.
Okay, so as we wrap, and we need to wrap, resources here for your reference going forward. We might change the third bullet to say back up your documents, pictures, desktop folders, but it's not really a backup. The last one, while we've been talking, we've been voting, and our next Ask Simpraxis will be 2 weeks hence, and we will talk about Microsoft Forms. So intro to Microsoft Forms. Thanks for the folks who joined live today, who voted up that next topic. We'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. If you've got questions, keep the chat going. But we're gonna wrap it up and wish you a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Simpraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues. Join us again as we release new content every other Wednesday.